Hey there, parents. Welcome to season 2 of the Whole Parent Podcast. If you've been listening, you know this is the podcast that is all about how to make your life as a parent easier and better with brain-based parenting techniques. This season, we are taking that to a whole new level and getting into parenting challenges that matter the most. Things like getting your kids to stop fighting with each other and actually get along, ending the bedtime battles once and for all, and getting your kids to actually want to listen to you. In addition to these deep dive solo episodes, I also have some amazing guest episodes lined up with parenting experts I know you're going to love. People like Alfie Kohn, Dan Siegel, Eli Harwood, Dr. Shafali, and returning to the podcast, Tina Payne Bryson. We also have some amazing experts from outside the parenting world that I think are going to absolutely transform the way that you parent. People like best-selling relationship author Eve Rodsky, the founding director for the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence, Marc Brackett, and children's book expert and former head of the Children's Literature Department for the New York Public Library System, Betsy Bird. They'll all be here to share their wisdom with you and give you actionable tools that you can start using in your life today. And here's the really big news. My brand new book, Punishment-Free Parenting, The Brain-Based Way to Raise Your Kids Without Raising Your Voice, is coming out right in the middle of season 2 on January 28th, 2025. It's packed with all of the brain-based knowledge and science-backed strategies that you already love to help you tame toddler tantrums, set effective boundaries, and get kids to actually want to cooperate with you, all without ever having to punish yourself or your kids. You can pre-order that now on digital, hardcover, or if you prefer to hear it read to you by me, on audiobook. Head to the link in the description and lock in your copy today and be one of the first to experience how this book can absolutely transform your parenting journey. All right, let's jump into today's episode.
It's a brand new day. Wake up every morning and say, it's a brand new day. Take a good day, make it great. Okay.
Welcome to the Whole Parent Podcast. I am so excited for those of you who are tuning in. I have a person who I've been a fan of for a long time from a distance, but who I'm just getting to meet today. It's Marc Brackett, Dr. Marc Brackett from the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. Marc, welcome to the Whole Parent Podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here with you.
Yeah, no, well, your work is so transformative for so many parents, and I think a lot of us know your work, but we may not know that it's you who's kind of been behind a lot of the emotion regulation stuff. So you are kind of the hero behind the scenes for me. I know that emotional intelligence has been a really big struggle for me, and I definitely was one of those people who just in my own parenting journey was way more interested, or just my life journey, way more interested in just avoiding all of the negative emotions. Mm-hmm. And, I don't often talk about her on the podcast, but my wife, even to a greater extent, for her, she's I don't know how much you know about Enneagram, but she's like an Enneagram type 3. And she feels lots of big emotions, but she's not a fan. And so when we came across your work and we were like, oh man, and then we had children, when we had started having kids, our first child is extremely emotional. And how do we support and how do we do that well instead of just kind of squashing that down? And a lot of it came from understanding why emotions are important. And so I wonder if you can just speak to that, because I've talked a lot about that on the podcast, but I would love to hear your perspective. Like, why emotions? Why should we be encouraging our kids to feel their feelings?
Yeah, I mean, that could be our whole time together. I think it's nice to think about, like, what would life be like without emotion? I mean, we'd have no joy. We'd have no grief. Some people would say, okay, that's good. I don't want any grief. But we'd have no pride. We'd have no excitement. We'd have no contentment. It would just be like Dr. Spock's walking across the world. In a more serious kind of way of thinking about it, I like to think about emotions as being data and their information. And so there's 5 reasons. I'm like a broken record about this. The first is that emotions drive our attention, memory, and learning. So, for example, if your listeners are bored with us right now, they've got serious issues. But the real, we're not engaging them, right? So we're not creating an emotional climate on this podcast that is making them feel like they want to keep going, listening. And so emotions are the drivers of our attention. So that's why it's so important at school and at work. How people feel matters for where they pay attention. The second is decision making. You think about it, like your choice of where you want your kid to go to college, your choice of what you wear. It's all about feeling. It's all about how it makes you feel. We like to think of ourselves as being these irrational creatures, but the truth is, whether or not we get up and exercise in the morning or what we decide to eat is often rooted in our feelings. The third is relationships. I talk about emotions as being kind of signals to either approach or avoid. So for example, like when we first started talking, you're like a really nice guy, you're warm, you're engaging. And so it's like, all right, I want to talk to this guy. And there are people that I meet and that you meet and that your listeners meet who kind of had, facial expressions that are signals like, stay away, like I'm more powerful than you. That's not an approach. That's an avoid.
Right.
So that's facial expression, it's vocal tone, it's body language. The fourth is just for our physical and mental health, that our emotions drive that. So little feelings, if they're not dealt with, become big feelings. I talk about emotions as being, these automatic kind of experiences. And when they're intense and for long duration, it means we have to do something about it. And if we don't have the skills to do something about it, our mental and physical health can decline.
Sure.
The final is just performance. As someone who teaches at a very high-powered university, every one of my students, I always say, has higher grades than I ever had, and they have better test scores than I ever had.
Sure.
Except I grade their papers. And, I just had a lot of imposter syndrome when I first started working here because I grew up with, my father was an air conditioning repairman. My mother had various jobs. Neither one of them had graduated from college. And here I am now working at an Ivy League university. It was just a lot of weird feelings. And I just had this, belief system that every one of my students was a superstar, which they kind of were on paper, but they also were all going to be enormously successful.
Sure.
And that has proven to be wrong. And because I always joke with my students, your IQ gets you in, but it doesn't get you out. People really want to be around people that are emotionally intelligent. No matter how smart they are, people want to be around people that have these skills. And so those are the 5 reasons why emotions matter from my perspective.
No, I love that for all of the 5 reasons that Marc just identified. And the way that I talk about it in the book, a couple things that I heard just pop out in those 5 reasons. And you might think that you sound like a broken record, but I've never heard you articulate those 5 in that exact way. So it's not a broken record to me. And I feel like I've heard quite a lot from you. The big things that I heard that pop out to me are, number 1, unresolved emotions or unexpressed emotions, unlabeled emotions. These are not benign, right? Like these metastasize in us. And the quote that I use is actually one from somebody in my counseling program. My master's degree, I had to take some counseling courses at the School of Professional Counseling. And the therapist who was there said, if you don't work through your trauma works through you. And so I kind of recontextualized that and said, if you don't work through your emotions in general, your emotions work through you. And I think that that's the first piece, is that people who are terrified of being run by their emotions and therefore they don't want to express their emotions are paradoxically way more likely to be run by their emotions. And I think that that's a big thing for parents who are like, man, I can't figure out why I'm always losing it on my kid. And it's like, well, actually, the reason that you're losing it on your kid is because you're not having any outlets. You're not getting the exercise that you need. You're not doing all of these other things that help with emotional regulation. And so that was the first thing that just popped out to me. And then the second thing you mentioned, and I think that this is a really big point, and I just would love to sit here for a moment, is this idea that we have this false perception that humans are rational most of the time, or that we're logical creatures, that we live in our prefrontal cortex. And I think, at least from how I understand it, and if you tell me I'm wrong, man, I got to email my publisher immediately. But the way that I understand it is our brains really work much quicker in our emotion centers. Our emotions are much quicker to respond to a situation. And so most often what we're actually doing is justifying or rationalizing our emotions, or lack thereof. Like, we're suppressing our emotions. We're not thinking about things logically and then having emotions about those things that we think about logically. We're actually feeling first. And that's part of the really important data that you're talking about. If you don't let yourself feel, then you're actually only perceiving, 10% of the world or something like that. And I think that that's essential for understanding the performance aspect as well, of saying like, yeah, the most successful people are not the people with the highest IQ. And Daniel Goleman says this in his kind of mid 90s big EQ stuff, is that really the driver of success is how well you communicate with people. And I certainly see that out in the world today. Or maybe I wish I did.
You might have to rewrite your chapter. Just kidding. I thought I would just put that out there. I'm just kidding.
Yeah,
with you.
Good.
What you say makes a lot of sense. I think bifurcating our emotional life from our cognitive life is tough, right? Because, you have and it creates a feeling. You have a feeling. It makes you think a certain way. So I would just keep it broader than that. Sometimes I'm just like sitting around, and I'm like, a memory of my father or mother who have passed pops into my mind. And all of a sudden I have that feelings of nostalgia. This past weekend, I have two brothers and we're very close, but we don't see each other a lot. They took the train up to my house and we spent the weekend together. We had a great time and we were reminiscing, and that reminiscing led to lots of feelings about our upbringing and our relationships and our parents. And you're right about the idea that I think the hardest piece is that oftentimes people have been taught that emotions make you weak, and that when you're having strong, unpleasant feelings, the job that you have is to ignore, deny, repress, suppress, which goes back to what you were saying, which doesn't work for you. That's why we eat the things we don't want to eat. It's why we don't get enough sleep or good sleep. It's why we drink too much alcohol. It's why we blow up with our friends. It's why we can't say I love you to someone in a way that makes them feel loved.
Or apologize.
Or ask for forgiveness, because we have these feelings about our feelings also, which is a whole nother concept called meta emotions. As a kid, when I was being bullied terribly, I was feeling shame for a variety of reasons. But my father was that kind of tough guy who was, toughen up, son. And so I was also afraid to tell my father about my bullying, because there's just layers and layers of emotion. And the point of all that is that we need to have a new attitude about emotion. And because our beliefs about feelings drive what we do with our feelings. And so I think you're on the same boat as I am, which is that emotions are data, they're information, they're everyday experiences. Let's embrace them. Let's love them all, and let's learn how to use them wisely so that we can have good relationships and make good decisions and have our dreams come true.
Yeah, and I think that this is, that's actually, I've started to, now that I've done the page proofs, I'm like giving away too much about the book and people aren't going to buy it because they're just like, I just heard it on the podcast. But I think that this is actually a really good point that so the chapter title is Emotions Are Your Superpower. And it's because of this concept of all emotions are data that we can use in our lives to actually make better decisions, to have better relationships. And that if we don't leverage that we are just leaving data on the table. And we're just saying, hey, I'm going to make my decisions void of the best available input that my physical body is giving me. And I think that this is a really, that was probably the biggest thing that I've taken away from your work. And I quote you in the book as saying, the difference between being an emotion scientist and an emotion judge. And I think a lot of people don't understand what a scientist is. And so I adjusted a little bit to say an emotions detective, because I think people have a really clear idea that like a detective is like a person who's investigating things. But people don't often realize that a scientist is actually, your term is actually more true, right? Detectives actually do come into things oftentimes trying to prove something, right? Versus a scientist, in the best way, the scientific method is expressed as, yeah, you know what? If I'm right or I'm wrong, those are both good pieces of information. Like those both teach me something about the world. And so can you speak to that a little bit? Like, why is it so important that we teach not only ourselves, but also our kids to become people who are emotion scientists instead of emotion judges?
Yeah, I want to take a step back first, which is, I have these guiding principles to my work. And, as you mentioned, the title of my book is Permission to Feel. And I think it's important to start there. Meaning that I feel like the first goal that we have to have for ourselves and for our children is we have to give ourselves and we have to give our kids permission to feel. And what I mean by that is that we just have to acknowledge that we are feelings creatures and that our emotions are driving all aspects of our lives. And that whether it's happiness or anxiety or serenity or despair, that is life. And we're going to give ourselves and we're going to give our kids the permission to have all those feelings. And then once we have that permission, and I say, people have given me a little bit of pushback on that whole thing. Like, who are you to give me permission to feel? Well, the truth is, and you know this probably from reading my book, I had a pretty tough childhood. You know, I had abuse in my childhood, sexual abuse, and a lot of bullying from a neighbor who, that was the abuse, and then bullying in school. And I did not have a happy childhood. And I grew up in a family where my mother was having kind of nervous breakdowns all the time. And my father was the toughen up guy. And so here I was at 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old being terribly abused and not feeling like I could tell anybody about my experience. Like, that's a parent's worst nightmare, just to tell you, I mean, for the most part. And it's also the worst nightmare for a child, right? To have to be living through horrific circumstances and not feel like they can say, hey, mom, hey, dad, like, this is happening. I'm scared. Or I feel like disgust or whatever it is.
Right.
And I say that just because I just feel it's so important for people to recognize these signals. And I know that I was emitting signals as a child. Help me. I'm not happy. Something is wrong. But because of my parents' own challenges with their own emotional lives, they miss those signals. And so I have to say that, whether it's uncomfortable or not for people.
Sure.
And so we have to be a step ahead of our kids in terms of creating the conditions for them to be their true, full feeling selves. And we can't do that until we are for ourselves. It's really hard to do that for our kids when we don't do that for ourselves.
Yeah, I think Brene Brown even says that's impossible, right? Like, Brene Brown even goes as far as to say, like, you cannot give your kids what you cannot give yourself. Yeah. And I think that's, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt that. I just think that's such a good, that's like a foundational principle. And I think that's where so many parenting related voices do miss, is that they are so focused on the child and what's happening in the child and how to correct the behavior in the child, how to prepare the child for resilience or for the long term, or that they fundamentally miss. And what your experience kind of speaks to is your parents would not have allowed for that to happen, but because of their own stuff, they had no knowledge or awareness.
Or they weren't attentive to my emotional needs. They didn't ask questions. They didn't notice, the signals. It's hard to notice. And when you're anxious yourself and you're kind of like freaking out every day, worrying about your own survival, or you're angry at the world, you're not looking for these details. You miss the details. That's why we need an emotional intelligence, because it helps you pause and pay attention and process and respond accordingly. But you really asked the question about the emotion scientist versus the emotion judge. And so you see what I'm getting at, though. The permission to feel is kind of the foundation, like just allowing ourselves to feel and allowing our kids to feel. And then we have to become curious explorers of those feelings, our own and other people's. We have to know, like, what am I really feeling? Why am I feeling this way? Am I feeling sad, or am I feeling hopeless? Am I feeling happy, or am I ecstatic? Am I down or disappointed? Am I angry, frustrated, overwhelmed, or panicky? Right. And, obviously, that I'm a big emotion vocabulary guy, which I have to plug, just a quick aside, my new app. I don't know if you've seen it yet, but it's called How We Feel.
I have not seen it yet. Okay, I'm downloading this like as soon as we get off this. How to Feel, and it's related to emotional. How we feel. Okay, I'll try, and I think I have a way in the show notes to have people have a direct link, whether they have a Google or
it's on both,
Apple
and it's
device.
Free.
Okay, I think I can do that. Hey parents, let's take a quick break. I need to share something really, really exciting with you. If you have ever found a tip or a strategy on this podcast that has helped you stop a tantrum, calm your own big emotions or those of your kids, or get kids to listen to you without having to yell at them, then I have a favor to ask you. My brand new book, Punishment-Free Parenting, comes out on January 28th, 2025, and I would love if you would pre-order it. This book is truly the culmination of everything that I have learned and shared about parenting on my platform, on the podcast, and on my social media channels. It's filled with advice on how to stop power struggles, to set boundaries that actually stick, and turn those chaotic moments into connection. At the end of the book, I even have this 5-step whole parent method. It's an acronym that you can use whenever your kids are in those big emotion states, when they're in a tantrum, whether they're 2 or 21, to get you through every single time without having to reinvent the wheel. So if I've been helpful to you on your parenting journey, please consider pre-ordering the book because it is absolutely the best way to help me keep doing this work. Plus, the book is going to give you the actionable tools to tackle those big everyday challenges in ways that I could never do on the podcast. You can pre-order the book right now in hardcover or digital, or may I suggest to get the audiobook read by me. When you do, you're not just supporting me, you're saying yes to a calmer, more connected parenting experience for both you and your kids. So head to the link in the description right now and grab your copy today. It absolutely means the world to me, and I can't wait for you to have it in your hands. Okay, let's get back to the episode.
Great. Well, you can just find it. It's called How We Feel. And it was co-developed with the co-founder and former CEO of Pinterest. So cool. Ben Silverman and I and our teams worked on this for 3 years. And we have about 1 million people who use the app. And it's really, I mean, I don't want to brag about an app that I built because I feel like it's a little off, but I'm bragging about it. It's really freaking cool.
Yeah.
It's beautifully designed. It's got 144 emotions that you can choose from with the words. It's got about 40 evidence-based regulation strategies built into it that people can practice. You can track your emotions over time and look for patterns at home, at school, at work. So check it out, everybody.
Mark, how did I not know about this? This is the coolest thing.
I
was not prepared.
Being a scientist, obviously.
I was not prepared for. Wait, so this app has 100 and you said 144 or roughly 144 emotions.
Actually, it has more than that. It has 144 on the interface. And then if you can actually search for another 500 feelings.
This is so good. So like most adults, and this is, I usually don't like quote one person so much, but Brene Brown, again, Atlas of the Heart, which I'm sure you've read and is very, very well versed. It's kind of the lay person's version of an emotional vocabulary, right? Like, and that in that book, she talks about how like most adults are experiencing basically a half dozen emotions at most. And so to have a place where you can go and in your ruler framework actually be able to accurately label, which is such a profound coping mechanism in and of itself. I mean, that's a regulation strategy. But then you have on top of that another, 3 dozen regulation strategies that you can do as well. That's super cool.
So that was my little side plug for the app, which, by the way, will always be available for free. There's a special fund that was created, so it'll always be free.
So cool.
But going back to, so I'm going to just bring people back to where we're at. We're going to give ourselves and everyone we love, and even the people we don't love that much, permission to feel. We're going to strive to be emotion scientists, be curious explorers as opposed to critical judges. So what does that look like? Well, the emotion scientist says, tell me more. I'm curious. What I'm hearing you say is that you're frustrated. But from my frustration is about a goal being blocked. And what I'm hearing is an injustice in your story. So it sounds like you might be feeling angry.
Yeah, anger.
And importantly, the emotion scientist recognizes that failure is inevitable. So I talk about this endlessly because, this next book I work is strictly on emotion regulation. And so I've been thinking about emotion regulation for 3 years now. And let me tell you, my family's been thinking about it too. And they've been witnessing my dysregulation from writing the freaking book.
Yeah.
Because if I'm not getting the words out that I want to get out, it's everybody else's fault, just so you know. Yeah. It's unbelievable.
That's helpful. Can I just I know that we just keep getting sidetracked, because that's so helpful to hear that Marc Brackett, this is one of the things that I try and do all the time is talk about if you saw me in Target not using any of my parenting hacks and just being just get my friggin' cart, to my you would realize that parenting is definitely the marathon, not the sprint. But to hear that Marc Brackett gets dysregulated and then misplaces his frustration as, anger at other people or whatever, dysregulation, just makes me feel so good about my own dysregulation. Can I just say that?
I'm happy to share my.
It was just like it's like it's such
hard.
a human thing. It's just such a human thing, and I think that like one of the downsides of the social media, generation, whatever you want to call it, is that we have this picture that some people have it figured out, and the truth is, the more you dig into the people like you who are actually on the ground doing the research, some people might be more advanced because of practice and journaling and using your app, but not. Like, nobody's perfect, and failure is inevitable.
I would tell you, I'm way better at dealing with my emotions today than I was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Way better. I know more strategies. I've practiced more strategies. But when I get triggered, at home, and it's a rough one, there are days where I'm like, Marc, take your meta moment. Marc, take a breath, walk out of the room. Say kind things to yourself. Remember, this feeling is impermanent. And then I walk back to them. I'm like, if I have to tell you one more time. And I'm like, Marc, what are you doing right now? And it's like, in that moment, I'm just like, forget about who cares that I'm the director of a Center for Freaking Emotional Intelligence. Anyway,
you got to give yourself permission to feel, Marc.
Forgiveness. What's that?
You got to give yourself permission to feel in those moments, my man. Like, you just got to.
Well, the thing is, permission to feel doesn't give you permission to be a jerk.
Yes. Good point. Good point. Yeah.
Well, and so, I'm trying to, my goal is to prevent myself from being as nasty as I could be.
Sure.
And I've gotten a lot better, and we can all get better at it. And it is life's work. And I just think it's very relieving for people, because like you said, not that I'm some like guru, about emotions, but, I'm a scientist who's written curriculum for 30 years and written books and practiced it, and I'm still struggling. And so I always think to myself, gosh, Marc, if you're still struggling, like, good luck for the rest of the world.
Yeah.
But the rest of the world needs to just learn more, practice more, refine, and you get better. But you're never going to be perfect. And that's okay.
Yeah. Practice makes better. Practice makes better. And I think that's, with an emotion, being an emotion scientist, like, even in that, there are moments when all of us aspire to be, for those of us who are aware of this paradigm, and of course, I'm sure that you would agree with this, none of us are all or none, right? Like, this is variations of gray. We're not always an emotion scientist. We're not always an emotion judge. This is just a paradigm that helps us frame our own emotional intelligence. But like, we all exist on this continuum where when life is hard, when we're triggered, when, I've also lost my dad, and we're coming up on the anniversary, I just start to get a little bit less patient with my kids. I start to get a little bit less emotionally aware with my spouse. Like, I realize that sometimes the best I can do is kind of being in the middle.
The best example I have for that is my mother-in-law got stuck here during the pandemic. It was unexpected. She came up from Panama for a wedding, and a very close friend of mine who she likes was getting married on March 3rd of 2020. Wow. Little did we know that no flights to Panama would occur. She was going to stay till like March 15th. On March 13th, all the airlines shut down, and they didn't open up to go to Panama until September. So, or April, May, June, July. And it was like, I love her. She's great. I speak Spanish, so we can communicate well. But let me tell you, by April 15th, I was like, what is happening? And then we had a real family blow up, and she yelled at me, and I yelled at her, and she said nasty things, and I said them back. And then I did go to bed that night, and going back to this joke about, my profession, I'm like walking up to my bedroom thinking, Marc, you're the freaking director of a Center for Emotional Intelligence. Like, you are a terrible, terrible role model. So let's do some scientific investigation here. Let's go to bed and let's ask yourself some questions. What's going on? I hated being at home. I didn't like working from home. 2, my mother-in-law was a little codependent. She didn't want to make her own coffee in the morning. She wanted me to make her coffee. I'm like, no, you learn how to make your own coffee. I don't like people in the morning. I'm not a morning, we're going to work on that. 3 is I'm always traveling. I travel 50% of the time. Now it was like a long time I hadn't been traveling, and I'm like, the routine was like monotonous.
Right.
I wasn't going to my hot yoga class, like all these things. But I had a pause to just gain an understanding of what were all the reasons, all the things that were behind my unpleasant emotions. And then I had to set a goal, which is, how do I want to be seen by my mother-in-law?
Sure.
How do I want to be experienced by my mother-in-law? And that really helped. And, I walked down the next morning and made her a cup of coffee. And I shifted my brain. I had a new attitude. And I'm going to tell you something that I think is helpful for people is I started making emotion regulation a game.
I love that.
And a creative process.
Yeah.
And so I started thinking to myself, like, Mark, you're going to come up with the most fun ways of dealing with your mother-in-law's emotions, or you're going to figure out a way to, like, not be so freaking narcissistic, and actually realize that, like, do you think she's 81 years old? Do you think she wants to be trapped in your house with you? Like, let's get real here.
For sure.
Anyhow, my point behind all this is that I started, like, I'd go for walks, and before I'd come into my home, I would grab the doorknob and I would pause and say, Mark, how do you want to show up tonight? And that would help me get into the right frame of mind to be the person I wanted to be. And then I would strategize, just start thinking, what do you need to do? What do you need to show up that way? All right, you need a longer walk today. You need to reframe. You need to take a few deep breaths. You need to be curious about her life instead of just so focused on your life. So yeah, I'll stop there.
I think I'm sure I've heard you say something to this effect, but one of the things that I've been lamenting on social media lately is that the way in which I get the most engagement, interaction from parents is by telling parents what to do in the responsive moment. Like, when your kid does this dysregulated thing, what should you do? And what I've been lamenting to the very few people who actually see the videos that aren't viral, which is one of those things, right, is, most of the best parenting we do is actually proactive, not reactive. What I'm hearing from you is that the real work of emotional intelligence is not what you do in the moment. It's not what you do when your kid starts hitting, starts biting, starts whatever, right? When your teenager has a mental health crisis. It's actually in the preparation. Like, it's really easy for parents to prioritize mental illness when they're sitting in an ER. It's really hard for those same parents to prioritize mental health and mental illness when their child's 7 and showing no signs of anxiety, depression, even though they know, statistically speaking, like, there has never been a time in recorded history when teenagers have greater mental health risk. How do we actually start to become proactive in how we're teaching emotion regulation? How do we become people who stand at the doorknob, whenever that is in our lives, and say, okay, how am I going to respond to my kid when, not if, they trigger me today? How do you, know when you're standing at the doorknob, whatever that place is, when you're drinking your cup of coffee in the morning, what are my strategies? What are my go-tos? And so you've already said the app. As we wrap here in the next 2 to 3 minutes, how can we connect with you and learn how to be proactive emotion scientists, to prepare ourselves before we're triggered, to become emotion scientists with our kids and teach our kids to do the same?
Yeah, I appreciate that setup. Here's the thing. When you have a mindset as an interventionist, right, you're always waiting for the bad thing to happen to fix. When you're a prevention scientist, which is what I like to call myself, you're thinking about what needs to happen in advance to reduce the number of new cases that go into the system. Let's say it's the prison system. Let's say it's the mental health system. Let's say whatever system. And it's always more cost effective. It's always easier for ourselves and others when we think prevention. The challenge is that we have not raised the skills of emotional intelligence high enough that people pay attention to them early on, right? We're still obsessed in education with literacy and math and, other subject areas, which are important. But, I'm not going to sleep until emotional intelligence becomes the other side of the report card, because it's critical that we start teaching children these skills as early as possible. It's a human right to be self-aware. Wow. It's a human right to have skills that you need to navigate your emotional life, because you can't have a life worth living if you can't deal with your emotions. It's just, you struggle way too much, and it's not fair when it can be prevented. So, I always say that if I do workshops for families, which I do quite a bit of them, If I call it How to Raise an Emotionally Intelligent Child Who Gets into an Ivy League University, 5,000 people show up.
Yep.
If I call it How to Become an Emotionally Intelligent Parent, 2 people show up.
Yep.
And it's, again, it's always about, like, the teachers think about, I'm adopting a curriculum to make the kids learn something. The parents think I'm reading this book to teach this to my kid. And the real challenge is that people haven't worked on themselves first. And so for me, my recommendation to your listeners is ask yourself, do you really give yourself permission to feel? Do you give your kid the permission to feel? Are you the scientist or the judge with your kid? If you have multiple children, are you a scientist with one of your kids and a judge with the other? Mm-hmm. Are there certain days of the week where you're more judgmental? Are there certain emotions that you're more judgmental about? And then I think the big one, based on where we went today with our conversation, is, are you the best possible role model for your child in terms of healthy regulation? Mm-hmm. So when you come home from work and you're frustrated, do you say, like, leave me alone? Or do you just go into the kitchen or the bathroom or your room and lock the door and just say, Daddy needs time? Or do you come home and say, honey, son, Daddy had a rough day at work. And I actually said something that was mean to a colleague of mine, and I feel terrible about it. And so I may look a little off tonight. And I just want you to know it has nothing to do with you. It's that I'm really upset with myself, and I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to say to this colleague of mine tomorrow to fix the situation, because I just don't want to have that in my relationships. And so I just want you to know that, honey. And I need about 15 minutes to myself just to get myself kind of make that transition home. And then we're going to go outside and take our walk or do something together. And so in that moment, what I've done is I've shown I'm vulnerable. I show I care about people. I've shown that I'm introspective. I problem solve. I mean, the list goes on. Yeah. And so that's my final recommendation for people that listen to your work, is that it sounds like it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work when you don't know what it is. But once you know what it is, you can start thinking about the kind of bite-sized practices that you can employ, as at home, and everywhere else. Right.
All right, Marc, where can we find you? Yeah, this has been such a fruitful conversation. I very rarely plug my book, but one of the foundational principles of what has become the book Punishment Free Parenting, which comes out in January, is that most of our good discipline is done by modeling. So you really put the ball on a tee.
There you go. Well,
you put the ball on a tee there. Yeah, no, my four pillars of parenting, I won't give you all 4, but one of the 4 is modeling. So yeah, put the ball on the tee for me. But people are going to know where to find my stuff because they're listening to this podcast, but where can we find your stuff? How can we get in touch?
I'm on all the social media channels. They're easy to find me. Like Instagram is, I guess the one I'm primarily on, which is just at marc.brackett. And my website is marcbrackett.com. It's marcbrackett.com. 2 other things is, 3 things. One is obviously my book is Permission to Feel. The app is called How We Feel. And then because all I do is stuff with feelings, I have this new web series where I interview the leading experts as well as artists to learn about how they deal with the feelings. And it's called Dealing with Feelings on YouTube. And I'm delighted for people to participate in all those things.
Fantastic. All of those resources will be linked in the show notes for anybody who's listening to this. Wherever you're finding it, you will find those resources linked below. Marc, thank you so much for all of your time today. You were so generous with us. And let's go give ourselves the permission to feel. Thank you again to Marc for being on the podcast today. I just wanted to say, if you have not followed his work yet, make sure that you go find his stuff in the show notes, get his book, Permission to Feel. I know that he's going to have another book coming out soon. Obviously, we're going to have him back on the podcast to talk about that work. Obviously, all the stuff he does for the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence as well. Make sure that you're interacting, engaging in that. His work is something that I reference as much as any other individual person in my upcoming book. It comes out in January of 2025. We talked about it a little bit here. But yeah, I just want to say thank you, Marc. You're one of my heroes. Thank you so much for sharing with all of us. And if you love this episode and you love the types of guests that we're able to get on the Whole Parent Podcast, make sure that you like this, that you subscribe to this podcast. Make sure that you write a review. Your reviews are how I know that these podcasts are not just going out into the abyss, that they're helping you to parent more effectively, that they're helping you to understand your child's brain and their emotions and build emotional regulation and build emotional intelligence with your child. all of that. If you love this, make sure that you are letting me know that. I read every single review that I get and rating the show 5 stars so that it can get out to as many parents as possible. Until then, this is all we have for you on this episode. Thank you again, Marc, of the Whole Parent Podcast.